The smoke rising from downtown Denver painted the October sky in shades of ash and despair. Major Declan Thorne stood atop the barricade at the Interstate 70 checkpoint, binoculars pressed against his weathered face, watching the city he'd sworn to protect devour itself from within. 3 weeks. That's all it had taken for the infection to transform America's heartland into a graveyard of shambling nightmares. Sir, motion sensors are going haywire. We've got movement, lots of it, 2 clicks east. Sergeant Kiera Vance's voice crackled through his earpiece, steady despite the tremor Declan detected beneath her professional veneer. She was positioned in the watchtower, her rifle scope trained on the abandoned suburbs that had become hunting grounds for the infected. Declan lowered his binoculars and turned to face the 140 soldiers under his command. They were the remnants of the 4th Infantry Division, cobbled together from survivors of overrun bases across Colorado. Some still wore their standard combat uniforms. Others had scavenged gear from the dead. All of them wore the same haunted expression, the look of people who'd seen their world end in teeth and blood. Listen up. Declan's voice cut through the nervous chatter. Intelligence indicates we're looking at a horde, possibly 10,000 strong, moving in our direction. This checkpoint is the only thing standing between them and the civilian evacuation at Peterson Air Force Base. We hold this line, or 15,000 men, women, and children die. There is no retreat. There is no surrender. We are the wall, and walls don't break. Corporal Finnegan Cross, a lanky sharpshooter from Montana who'd celebrated his 22nd birthday the day the outbreak began, checked his rifle for the 100th time. His hands shook slightly, but his jaw was set with determination. Beside him, Private Zara Dalton organized her medical supplies with methodical precision, her dark eyes betraying the fear her steady hands concealed. She'd been a nursing student before the world ended. Now she was all that stood between the wounded and death. Lieutenant Rowan Hayes approached Declan, tablet in hand, his analytical mind already calculating odds and trajectories. Sir, I've positioned our heavy machine guns at the choke points. Explosives are rigged along the highway. Private Brennan has created a kill box that should funnel them into our crossfire. But those numbers. He trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging between them like a guillotine blade. I know, Rowan, Declan said quietly, placing a hand on the younger man's shoulder. But we've got something they don't. We've got a reason to fight that goes beyond hunger. We've got humanity left in us. As if summoned by his words, the first of them appeared on the horizon. Captain Maverick Stone, commanding the southern flank, raised his fist in silent signal. Through the afternoon haze, they came. Not running, not shambling like in the movies, but moving with terrible purpose, their bodies twisted and broken yet driven by an insatiable need to feed. These were people once. Neighbors. Friends. Family. Now they were something else entirely, their eyes milky white, their mouths stained with evidence of their terrible transformation. Private Elias Brennan, crouched behind sandbags with the detonator in his sweating palms, whispered a prayer his grandmother had taught him. He was an engineer by training, an artist with explosives, but no amount of technical expertise had prepared him for the moral weight of what was coming. These weren't enemy combatants from a foreign land. These were Americans. And he was about to blow them apart. The moaning started low, like wind through a canyon, then built into a cacophony of hunger and rage. The horde surged forward, a wave of corrupted flesh and desperate hunger. Declan raised his hand, every eye on the battlefield fixed on him. The distance closed. 500 meters. 400. 300. For everyone we've lost, Declan shouted, his voice carrying across the checkpoint. For everyone we're saving. For the future we're going to build from these ashes. Hold the line. His hand dropped, and the world exploded into chaos. The initial volley of gunfire sounded like the world tearing itself apart. Tracers lit up the darkening sky as hundreds of rifles opened up simultaneously, creating a wall of lead between the living and the infected. Finnegan cross-controlled his breathing, finding the rhythm he'd learned on the shooting ranges of Fort Harrison, now a distant memory from a dead world. His first shot took down what had once been a middle-aged woman in a tattered business suit. His second dropped a teenage boy wearing the remnants of a football jersey. He stopped counting after 20. "Conserve your ammunition." Kira Vance's voice rang out from the watchtower. She'd been a drill instructor before the outbreak, known for breaking down cocky recruits and rebuilding them into soldiers. Now she was doing it again under the worst possible circumstances. Her own rifle barked methodically, each shot a kill, each kill a necessity she'd process later if there was a later. The first wave hit the obstacles 200 meters out. Abandoned cars, concrete barriers, and coils of razor wire created a maze designed to slow and separate the horde. It worked, but not as well as they'd hoped. The infected climbed over vehicles with disturbing agility, their bodies impaling on barbed wire only to drag themselves forward, oblivious to injuries that would drop a living person. "Detonate Sequence 1." Lieutenant Rowan Hayes commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with mathematical precision. Elias Brennan's fingers moved across the detonator. The first series of explosions ripped through the kill box, sending bodies and parts of bodies spiraling through the smoke. The concussive force shook the barricade, rattling teeth and bones. For a moment, Declan dared to hope. The horde's advance had stalled, hundreds destroyed in the initial blast. Then the smoke cleared, and his hope withered. They kept coming. Stepping over their own destroyed, crawling through craters still smoking with chemical fire, driven by something beyond pain or fear. The infection had stripped them of everything human except the shape of what they'd been. Zara Dalton crouched in the medical tent behind the main line, her hands already slick with blood. The first casualties were arriving. Private Marcus Webb, his leg torn open by shrapnel from a premature detonation. Specialist Chen, bitten on the forearm during a close encounter when her rifle jammed. The bite victims were the worst. Everyone knew the protocol. Everyone knew what a bite meant. "Please," Chen gasped, her eyes wide with terror as the black veins began to spread from the wound. "Please, I can fight it. I can." "I'm sorry," Zara whispered, tears streaming down her face as she reached for the sidearm she'd prayed she'd never have to use this way. The gunshot was lost in the greater symphony of violence, but it echoed in Zara's soul. On the southern flank, Captain Maverick Stone's position was deteriorating rapidly. A gap in the barriers had allowed a cluster of infected to breach the first line. His soldiers fought hand-to-hand now, using bayonets, knives, and rifle butts. Maverick himself grappled with what had once been a construction worker, the infected man's strength inhuman, his teeth snapping inches from Maverick's throat. "Little help here." Maverick grunted, muscles screaming as he held the creature at bay. Sergeant Luis Rodriguez appeared from the smoke, his combat knife finding the infected man's temple with brutal efficiency. Maverick nodded his thanks, no breath to spare for words. Declan moved through the chaos like a man possessed, his sidearm barking when infected broke through, his voice rallying soldiers when fear threatened to overwhelm discipline. He'd been a soldier for 18 years, served in 3 theaters of war, earned medals he kept in a drawer back home. None of it had prepared him for this. In conventional warfare, the enemy feared death. These things didn't fear anything. Second wave incoming. Kira's warning cut through the gunfire. Declan's heart sank. Through the gaps in the first horde, he could see them. Thousands more, moving with that terrible purpose, drawn by the noise of battle like sharks to blood. Rowan appeared at Declan's side, his tablet cracked but functional. "Sir, ammunition expenditure is 30% above projections. At this rate, we'll be dry in 90 minutes. The southern flank has lost structural integrity. And..." He paused, jaw tightening. We've lost 18 soldiers. Kia or infected. 18 families who would never know closure. 18 futures erased. Declan shoved the grief down, locked it away with all the other horrors he'd compartmentalize later. Pull the southern flank back to secondary positions. Tell Brennan to prep the highway charges. If we can collapse the overpass, we can funnel them into a tighter kill zone. As Rowan rushed off to relay orders, Declan allowed himself one moment of weakness. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, creased and worn. His daughter, smiling at her college graduation 3 years ago. He didn't know if she was alive, dead, or something worse. The last message he'd received said she was in Boston when the outbreak hit the East Coast. That was 2 weeks ago. "This is for you, baby girl," he whispered, then tucked the photo away and returned to the war. Night fell like a shroud over the battlefield, but the fighting never stopped. Floodlights mounted on the barricades carved harsh shadows across the killing field, illuminating a landscape transformed into hell. Bodies carpeted the approach to the checkpoint, hundreds deep in places, and still they came. The infected seemed endless, an inexorable tide of corrupted humanity that tested not just the soldiers' ammunition but their sanity. Finnegan Cross's world had narrowed to the scope of his rifle. Breathe. Acquire target. Squeeze. Repeat. His shoulder was bruised from recoil, his ears rang despite protection, and his eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. Beside him, Private Jamal Washington fed him magazines with mechanical efficiency, his own rifle set aside to keep Finn supplied. They'd met 3 weeks ago during the desperate retreat from Fort Carson. Now they moved like parts of the same machine. "Finn, you're 3 o'clock, the big one," Jamal called out. Finnegan swiveled, finding the target immediately. It had been a bodybuilder or maybe a soldier, its massive frame now turned to terrible purpose. It was dragging a smaller infected forward, using it as a shield. The tactical awareness chilled Finnegan more than the cold October wind. The virus was evolving, or perhaps some remnant of human cunning persisted in the infected brain. 2 shots. The first took the shield in the head, dropping it. The second caught the large infected in the eye socket. Both fell, absorbed into the carpet of death below. In the medical tent, Zara Dalton worked with the frantic energy of the damned. The wounded kept coming, carried by their comrades or limping in under their own power. She'd performed more amputations in the past 6 hours than most surgeons did in a career, removing bitten limbs in desperate attempts to stop the infection spread. It worked sometimes. More often, it just gave the victim a few more minutes of agony before the fever took them and the change began. "Doc, you need to see this," one of her assistants, Private Nadia Reeves, called from the triage area. She stood over a soldier Zara didn't recognize, his uniform so covered in gore it was impossible to read his name tag. But it wasn't his injuries that drew Zara's attention. It was the bite on his neck, clear as day, and the fact that he was still lucid 2 hours after infection. "What's your name, soldier?" Zara asked, kneeling beside him. "C. Calloway. Private First Class Devon Calloway, ma'am." His voice was steady despite the sweat pouring down his face. "I know what I should be by now. I can feel it, trying to take over, but I'm still here. Still me." Zara's mind raced. Immunity? Resistance? In 3 weeks, she'd never seen anyone survive a bite for more than 20 minutes before turning. "Nadia, I need blood samples, for fluids, Anne." The tent shook as an explosion rocked the compound. Dirt rained from the canvas ceiling. Through the entrance, Zara could see fire lighting up the night sky. Lieutenant Rowan Hayes stood in the command post, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from the remaining cameras. His analytical mind, which had served him so well in tactical planning, now catalogued their slow destruction. The southern flank had collapsed entirely, forcing Captain Maverick Stone's forces to fall back to the secondary line. The northern position was holding, but barely. And the eastern approach, where the highway overpass had been demolished, had become a choke point where infected piled up in struggling masses, climbing over each other in their frenzy to reach living flesh. "Sir, we need to consider fallback protocols," Rowan said to Declan, who stood beside him, blood splattered across his uniform from a close-quarters encounter an hour earlier. "At current attrition rates." "We hold," Declan interrupted, his voice iron. "Those civilians need another 8 hours to complete evacuation. We give them 8 hours. We might not have 8 hours to give." Declan turned to face his lieutenant, and Rowan saw something frightening in his commander's eyes. Not fear, not despair, but absolute resolution. "Then we give them everything we have left. Every bullet, every breath, every drop of blood. We are the line, Rowan." Outside, Kira Vance had descended from her watchtower when a support beam cracked under concentrated infected assault. Now she fought on the barricade itself, her rifle slung in favor of a fire axe she'd pulled from an emergency station. The blade rose and fell with brutal rhythm, each swing ending a threat, each kill a small victory in a war they were losing by degrees. "Sergeant, fall back," one of her soldiers called, but Kira couldn't hear over the moaning of the infected. 3 of them had made it over the barricade, their hands grasping, mouths snapping. She'd always told her recruits that fear was a tool, not a master. Use it, don't let it use you. Now she proved her own teaching, channeling terror into fury, fighting with the desperate strength of someone protecting not just herself but everyone behind her. The axe lodged in an infected skull, stuck. Kira drew her sidearm, putting rounds into the other 2 at point-blank range. Their bodies fell backward off the barricade, and she wrenched her axe free, already looking for the next threat. Elias Brennan huddled in his position, hands shaking as he prepared the last of the heavy charges. He was an engineer, not a warrior, and every instinct screamed at him to run. But he stayed, because the soldier next to him stayed. And the one next to her stayed. And somehow that chain of courage held them all in place, defying the rational fear that should have scattered them to the winds. "Brennan, we need that northeast section wired now." Rowan's voice crackled through his radio. "On it," Elias responded, grabbing his kit and sprinting through the chaos. An infected lurched from behind a burning vehicle. Elias didn't think, just reacted, swinging his tool bag in a wild arc that connected with the creature's temple. It staggered, and he ran, heart hammering, the 100 meters to the northeast section feeling like miles. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of gray that matched the smoke, Declan stood atop the command post and surveyed the battlefield. They'd held through the night, but the cost had been devastating. Nearly 40 soldiers dead or turned. Ammunition down to 30%. The barricade breached in 4 places, held by sheer determination and bodies thrown into gaps. But the horde had thinned. Whether they'd killed enough or the rest had wandered off in search of easier prey, Declan didn't know. What he knew was that they'd survived the night. And in this new world, survival was victory enough. The gray light of dawn revealed the true horror of the night's battle. The approaches to the checkpoint resembled a medieval battlefield, bodies stacked so thick in places that they formed hills of the dead. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of gunpowder, blood, and decay that made even hardened soldiers gag. Declan walked the line, meeting the eyes of his troops, seeing his own exhaustion reflected back at him. "Get some rest while you can," he ordered. "Rotation system. Half on watch, half on sleep. We're not out of this yet." Finnegan Cross stumbled toward the rest area, his legs barely holding him upright. He'd been in position for 14 straight hours, firing until his rifle barrel glowed hot and his trigger finger cramped. Jamal Washington walked beside him, neither man speaking. Words felt inadequate to describe what they'd witnessed, what they'd done. They collapsed onto cots in a tent that smelled of sweat and fear. Finnegan closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he drifted off, he saw faces. The woman in the business suit. The teenage football player. The child that couldn't have been more than 10, its Sunday school dress torn and bloody. He'd killed them all, and logically he knew it was mercy, that the people they'd been were already gone. But his heart didn't understand logic. "You good?" Jamal asked quietly. "No," Finnegan admitted. "You?" "No." Jamal was silent for a moment, then added, "My sister was in Denver. Downtown, near the Capitol. I keep wondering if she's out there, if I've already." He couldn't finish the sentence. Finnegan reached over, gripping his friend's shoulder. They lay there in the gray light, two young men mourning a world that would never return, stealing what rest they could before the next wave. In the medical tent, Zara studied the blood samples she'd taken from Private Devon Calloway with growing fascination and horror. 4 hours post-infection, and he was still human. His vitals were deteriorating, his temperature climbing, but the characteristic aggression and loss of cognition hadn't manifested. He lay strapped to a gurney as a precaution, sweat-soaked but conscious. "Tell me about yourself, Devon," Zara said, both to keep him talking and to gather data. If he was somehow resistant, understanding why could save countless lives. "Not much to tell, ma'am," Devon rasped. "Grew up in rural Louisiana. Joined up to pay for college. Was studying to be a teacher before all this." He convulsed, muscles spasming. "When it passed," he continued, "had malaria twice as a kid. Real bad. Doctors said it was a miracle I survived." Malaria. Zara's mind raced. The infection behaved like a parasite, overwhelming the host system. Could previous exposure to a parasitic disease create some kind of resistance? It was a thread of hope, thin as spider silk, but she grasped it desperately. "Nadia, I need you to document everything. Every symptom, every progression. If Devon here can teach us how to fight this thing, we owe it to him and everyone else to learn." Devon managed a weak smile. "Always wanted to be a teacher, ma'am. Guess this is my first lesson." Captain Maverick Stone surveyed the ruins of the southern flank. The barricade was gone, destroyed by the combined weight of the horde and the explosives they'd used to stop them. Bodies littered the ground, and among them, he recognized faces. Sergeant Marcus Chen, a good soldier and better friend, lay tangled with 3 infected he'd taken with him. Private Ashley Morgan, who'd talked constantly about her daughter waiting at Peterson. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, who'd been 2 weeks from retirement when the outbreak began. Maverick knelt beside each one, collecting their dog tags with reverent care. They'd died buying time for strangers to escape, sacrificing themselves for an abstract concept of duty and humanity. He wondered if it mattered, if anything they did mattered in the face of the world's ending. Then he heard laughter from the rest area, soldiers sharing a joke despite everything, and he had his answer. As long as they could still laugh, still care, still mourn their dead, humanity survived. That made it matter. Rowan Hayes hadn't slept. Instead, he'd spent the dawn hours analyzing their situation with the cold logic that defined him. The numbers were brutal. They'd lost 43 soldiers in the night. Ammunition was critical. Medical supplies nearly exhausted. The checkpoint's structural integrity was compromised in multiple locations. By any rational assessment, they should fall back to Peterson and hope the Air Force Base's defenses held. But Rowan had learned something during the night. Some things transcended rational assessment. He'd watched Elias Brennan, an engineer who froze during firefights, run through hell to place charges that saved a dozen lives. He'd seen Zara Dalton, who wept every time she had to put down an infected soldier, return to her work with unwavering dedication. He'd stood beside Declan Thorne, who had every reason to abandon this position and search for his daughter, yet stayed because others needed him more. Rationality said they were dead. Humanity said they'd hold the line anyway. Rowan was beginning to understand which mattered more. Kira Vance sat alone on the barricade, cleaning her weapons with methodical precision. Her arms ached from swinging the fire axe, her throat was raw from shouting orders, and her heart was broken in ways she'd never admit. Before the outbreak, she'd been engaged. Her fiancé, Thomas, had been visiting family in Denver when the infection hit. She'd heard nothing from him in 3 weeks. Every infected she killed might be him. Every face she saw in her scope might be the man she'd planned to spend her life with. So she cleaned her weapons, maintained her discipline, and locked her grief away where it couldn't compromise the mission. There would be time to mourn when this was over. If she survived. If any of them survived. A sound drew her attention. Movement in the death field below. Her rifle came up instinctively, but she held fire. Something was moving down there, crawling over bodies with agonizing slowness. Not an infected. A survivor. Someone had been out there all night, hiding among the corpses. Medic! Kira shouted, already climbing down. We've got a live one. The figure was small, child-sized, covered in blood and filth. As Kira approached, she realized it was a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, her eyes wide with terror and shock. She'd survived out there somehow, playing dead among the actual dead while hell raged around her. "It's okay, sweetheart," Kira said softly, scooping the child up. "You're safe now. I've got you." The girl didn't speak, just buried her face in Kira's shoulder and trembled. As Kira carried her back to the checkpoint, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. If this child could survive the night in that field of death, maybe they could all survive. Maybe there was a future worth fighting for after all. Declan watched Kira return with the child and felt his resolve strengthen. 8 more hours. They just needed to hold 8 more hours. He'd give everything he had to make it happen. The afternoon sun beat down on the checkpoint, but it brought no warmth. Declan stood in the command post, radio pressed to his ear, listening to the report from Peterson Air Force Base with growing dread. "Repeat that, Peterson," he said, though he'd heard clearly the first time. "Evacuation is experiencing delays," the voice crackled back. "We need an additional 12 hours, minimum. I say again, 12 hours minimum before we can accept incoming." 12 hours. They'd been promised 8, and that had seemed impossible. Declan looked at the tactical display, at the dwindling numbers of his force, at ammunition reserves bleeding toward 0. 12 hours was a death sentence. "Understood, Peterson. We'll hold." He said it without hesitation, though every rational part of his brain screamed that it was suicide. "Major, we can send." "Negative," Declan interrupted. "You keep every bird and every soldier protecting those civilians. We knew the job when we took it. Thorn out." He set down the radio and found Rowan watching him, the lieutenant's analytical mind clearly calculating their odds of survival. They both knew the number. 0.3%, maybe less. Not odds worth taking. Not odds anyone should accept. "Gather the command staff," Declan said. "They deserve to know." 10 minutes later, Declan stood before Kira, Maverick, Rowan, and Elias. Zara had been called but was too busy with Devon Calloway's deteriorating condition to attend. The little girl they'd rescued, who still hadn't spoken, sat in the corner wrapped in a blanket, a silent witness to command decisions. "Peterson needs 12 more hours," Declan said without preamble. "Our ammunition won't last that long. Our defenses are compromised. Our forces are exhausted. By any reasonable assessment, we can't hold." Silence greeted his words. Then Maverick spoke, his gravelly voice thoughtful. "So we be unreasonable. We've got maybe 4 hours of sustained combat left in us," Rowan said, his tactical mind working the problem despite the impossible parameters. "Unless we do something desperate." "I'm listening," Declan said. "The infected are attracted to noise, movement, living prey. What if we give them some?" Rowan pulled up a map on his cracked tablet. "There's a shopping mall 3 clicks south. Big, defensible, and full of vehicles with alarms. A small team could reach it, create a massive distraction, draw a significant portion of the horde away from the checkpoint. A suicide mission, Kira said flatly. A buying time mission, Rowan corrected. The team reaches the mall, triggers every alarm, every noisemaker they can find. The horde diverts to investigate. We get our 12 hours at the checkpoint. The team. He trailed off. The team dies, Finnegan said from the tent entrance. He'd woken and overheard, as had Jamal and several others. The team dies so 15,000 people live. I'm in. Me too, Jamal added immediately. Now wait a minute, Declan started, but Kira cut him off. It's a good plan, sir. Best chance we have. I'll lead the team. No. The voice came from an unexpected source. Elias Brennan stepped forward, his hands steady for the first time since the outbreak began. I'll lead it. I'm the best with explosives, with creating maximum chaos. You're all better soldiers, better at holding the line. This is where I can matter most. Declan looked at the engineer, seeing him truly for the first time. Elias wasn't a warrior, had never pretended to be. But he was willing to die for others, and that made him the best of them. I can't order you to do this, Declan said. You're not ordering, sir. I'm volunteering. Elias managed a shaky smile. Besides, I've always wanted to do a proper demolition job on a mall. Hated those places. In the medical tent, Zara fought a different battle. Devon Calloway was still alive, still human, but barely. The infection had spread through his system, and she could see the war being waged in his cells under the microscope. His immune system, strengthened perhaps by his childhood malaria, was fighting back in ways she'd never witnessed. Devon, stay with me, she urged as his eyes rolled back, his body convulsing. Trying, ma'am, he gasped between spasms. So, tired. Just want to sleep. No sleep, soldier. That's an order. Zara injected him with another dose of antibiotics, though she knew they were likely useless against the infection. She was working blind, desperate, throwing everything she had at a problem she barely understood. Devon's eyes focused on her, and for a moment, they were clear. If I turn, promise you'll make it quick. You're not turning. You're fighting, and you're winning. Zara didn't know if she was lying or not. She hoped not. The afternoon wore into evening, and Elias gathered his team. Finnegan and Jamal had insisted on coming, as had Private Yolanda Cruz, a combat engineer who'd worked with Elias before the outbreak, and Corporal Hassan Mahmoud, a quiet man who'd lost his entire family in the first days of the infection and seemed to welcome the chance to join them. 5 soldiers. 5 lives in exchange for 12 hours and 15,000 civilians. The mathematics of survival in the apocalypse. They loaded into a Humvee with enough explosives to level a city block, enough ammunition to fight a small war, and enough courage to face certain death with dark humor. So this is how it ends, Yolanda said, checking her rifle. Death by shopping mall. My teenage self would be so disappointed. At least the food court will finally be worth dying for, Hassan added, and they all laughed, the sound brittle but real. Elias climbed into the driver's seat, hands steady on the wheel. Declan appeared at the window, offering his hand. Elias shook it firmly. Give them hell, son, Declan said, voice thick with emotion. Sir, hell's got nothing on what we're about to do. Elias started the engine, and the Humvee rolled out of the checkpoint, 5 doomed souls driving toward their end with their heads held high. Kira watched them go, the little girl clutched in her arms. The child had finally spoken, just one word, brave. It seemed to sum up everything perfectly. As darkness fell again, motion sensors began screaming. The second wave was coming, drawn by the sounds of the previous night's battle. But this time, they had a plan. This time, they had hope, purchased with the lives of 5 heroes who'd chosen sacrifice over survival. Declan raised his hand, his soldiers ready despite exhaustion, despite fear, despite everything. They were the line. They would hold. For Brennan's team, he shouted. For every soul we're protecting. For the future. Hold the line. And once again, the world exploded into chaos. The Humvee tore through the abandoned streets of suburban Denver, weaving between crashed cars and the wandering infected. Elias drove with focused intensity, every sense heightened by the knowledge that this was his last mission. Beside him, Finnegan worked the mounted gun, dropping any infected that got too close. In the back, Jamal, Yolanda, and Hassan prepared the explosives with practiced efficiency. Maul's 2 minutes out, Elias called over the roar of the engine. Everyone clear on the plan? We rig the main supports, set charges in the parking structure, wire every vehicle we can reach, Yolanda recited. Create enough noise to wake the dead. Oh wait, they're already awake. Gallows humor. I like it, Hassan said, his usually quiet voice almost cheerful. There was a strange freedom in accepting death, a clarity that came from knowing the end was written. The Silverwood Mall rose before them, for stories of concrete and glass, a monument to a consumer culture that had died with the rest of civilization. The parking lot was filled with abandoned vehicles, and as they drove closer, they could see infected wandering the structure, trapped by their own confusion in the maze of cars. This is going to be loud, Jamal observed, loading his rifle. That's the idea, Elias replied, crashing through the parking lot barrier. Immediately, car alarms began to wail, their lights flashing in the growing darkness. The infected in the lot turned as one, drawn by the noise, but the team was already moving, spreading out with their explosive packages. Back at the checkpoint, Declan listened to the distant car alarms and knew Brennan's team had reached their target. Here they come, Kira reported from her position. The horde's shifting, moving south toward the mall. It was working. Thousands of infected peeled away from their approach to the checkpoint, drawn by the cacophony of sound from the mall. It wouldn't last long, but it bought them precious time. All positions, make every shot count. Declan ordered. The brave souls at that mall are buying us time with their lives. We don't waste a second of it. The reduced horde hit their lines with familiar fury, but the thin numbers made all the difference. The soldiers found their rhythm, working in pairs and teams, covering each other, making ammunition count. They were exhausted, running on fumes and determination, but they held. At the mall, Elias's team worked with desperate speed. Yolanda rigged the structural supports in the parking garage with enough C4 to bring the entire structure down. Hassan wired a chain of vehicles, creating a domino effect of explosions. Finnegan and Jamal set up on the second level, using the vantage point to drop infected below while protecting the engineers. We've got movement, lots of it, Finnegan reported, watching through his scope as the horde converged on the mall. They're coming from everywhere. How long? Elias asked Yolanda as she connected the final detonator. 30 seconds. But boss, we've got a problem. Someone needs to stay and trigger the sequence. The remote detonators busted, too much interference from all the metal. The team froze, the implications sinking in. They'd all accepted death, but theoretical sacrifice was different from literal reality. One of them would have to stay behind, trigger the explosives manually while the others had a chance, however slim, of escape. I'll do it, Elias said immediately. My plan, my responsibility. Like hell, Yolanda countered. You've got the best chance of getting the others out. I stay. Children, please, Hassan interrupted calmly. I'm the obvious choice. You all have people waiting, people who need you. I have ghosts. Let me be with them. Before anyone could argue, Hassan took the detonator from Yolanda's hands and pushed her toward the Humvee. Go. Give them the time we promised. Tell them Hassan Mahmoud stood his ground. Tell them I smiled at the end. Elias wanted to argue, but the infected were flooding into the parking structure now, hundreds of them, drawn by the alarms. Hassan. Go! Hassan shouted, already firing his rifle to cover their retreat. That's an order, Corporal. They ran. Elias hated himself for it, but he ran, leading his team back to the Humvee. The engine roared to life, and they crashed through the growing horde, heading for the mall exit. Hassan stood alone in the parking structure, surrounded by the infected, his rifle clicking empty. He dropped it and picked up the detonator, watching the creatures close in. He thought of his wife, his children, taken in the first days of the outbreak. He'd mourned them every day since, lived with the guilt of surviving when they hadn't. I'm coming, my loves, he whispered, and pressed the trigger. The explosion lit up the night sky, a massive fireball that consumed the mall and everything around it. The Humvee, half a mile away, was nearly thrown off the road by the shockwave. Elias fought the wheel, keeping them upright, tears streaming down his face. Hassan, you magnificent bastard, Jamal whispered, watching the flames reach toward the sky. The explosion drew every infected in a 5-mile radius, creating exactly the distraction they'd promised. At the checkpoint, Declan watched the fireball and bowed his head in respect. Mark the time, he said to Rowan. Hassan Mahmoud bought us this. We use every second. The infected pressure on the checkpoint eased dramatically. The soldiers, exhausted beyond measure, found themselves in something resembling a lull. It wouldn't last, but for now, they could breathe, reload, and tend to their wounded. In the medical tent, Zara watched in amazement as Devon Calloway's temperature began to drop. His vitals stabilized. The black veins receded slightly. Against all odds, his immune system was winning. Devon, can you hear me? She asked. His eyes opened, clear and focused. Still here, ma'am. Still human. Zara allowed herself tears of joy for the first time in weeks. One victory in a war of losses, but it was enough. It meant the infection could be fought. It meant hope. The Humvee limped back to the checkpoint an hour later, battle-scarred but intact. 4 soldiers instead of 5. Declan met them personally, helping them from the vehicle. Hassan, he asked, though he already knew. He stayed to trigger the charges, Elias reported, voice hollow. Died saving us all. Then we make sure it counted, Declan said firmly. Get some rest. You've earned it. As the team dispersed, the little girl approached Elias, still wrapped in her blanket. She looked up at him with ancient eyes and said simply, thank you. Elias knelt, meeting her gaze. We're the ones who should thank you, kiddo. You reminded us what we're fighting for. The night wore on, quieter now but no less tense. They'd bought their time, but the cost had been high. One more soldier lost to save the many. One more name to remember when this was over, if it was ever over. Declan walked the line again, seeing the toll in every face. They were close to breaking, pushed beyond any reasonable limit. But they hadn't broken yet. They held the line, hour by desperate hour, buying time with blood and courage. 12 hours. They just needed to last 12 more hours. Part 7, Dawn of the Dead World. The final hours before dawn were the hardest. Exhaustion had become a physical weight, dragging at every soldier's bones. Ammunition was measured in single magazines. Medical supplies were reduced to bandages and hope. The checkpoint itself was held together by sandbags and determination, both eroding under constant pressure. Finnegan Cross sat at his position, rifle braced, eyes scanning the darkness through a scope whose lens was cracked from a near miss hours earlier. Beside him, Jamal had finally succumbed to sleep, rifle clutched to his chest. Finn didn't have the heart to wake him. They'd been awake for nearly 40 hours straight. The human body had limits, and they'd surpassed them all. Movement in the darkness. Always movement. Individual infected now, scattered remnants of the horde that Hassan's sacrifice had fractured. Finn's finger found the trigger with familiar ease. Breathe. Aim. Squeeze. The infected fell, and Finn cycled the bolt, chambering his last round. His ammunition was gone. He drew his sidearm, checking the magazine. 6 rounds. When those were gone, he'd use his knife. When the knife broke, he'd use his hands. He wasn't stopping. Not now. In the command post, Rowan Hayes plotted their final moves with the precision of a chess master facing checkmate. Every soldier repositioned to cover gaps. Every remaining explosive placed for maximum effect. Every contingency planned for except the one that mattered most, victory. The numbers simply didn't allow for it. "Sir, you should see this," he said to Declan, pointing at the tablet. "Peterson's latest update. They've finished early. Transports are inbound. ETA 90 minutes. Declan stared at the screen, not quite believing. 90 minutes. After everything, after the sacrifice and blood and horror, they were 90 minutes from extraction. From survival. "Can we hold that long?" he asked, though he already knew Rowan's answer. Unknown variables make prediction difficult, but based on current ammunition reserves and structural integrity, it will be close, sir. Very close. Close enough to hope. Close enough to break your heart if you failed. Declan nodded, squaring his shoulders. Then we hold. Pass the word. 90 minutes to extraction. Every soldier who can walk gets on those transports. Kira Vance received the news with a grim smile. 90 minutes felt like eternity and an eye blink simultaneously. She'd been fighting on pure adrenaline for hours, her body a catalogue of bruises and cuts she hadn't had time to feel. The little girl, who'd finally given her name as Meredith, stayed close to Kira's side, having attached herself to the sergeant as a source of safety in a world gone mad. "You hear that, sweetie?" Kira said, reloading her last magazine. "Big birds are coming to take us somewhere safe. Will they have food?" Meredith asked, her voice small but growing stronger. "Mountains of it. And warm beds. And people who'll keep you safe." Kira didn't know if she was lying or not, but Meredith deserved hope. In the medical tent, Zara worked frantically to stabilize patients for transport. Devon Calloway, against all odds, was sitting up, weak but alive. His blood samples were packed in a cooler, carefully labeled. If they could get him to a real research facility, his immunity might be the key to ending the infection. He was more valuable than gold, more important than any of them realized. "I can walk, ma'am," Devon insisted, though he could barely stand. "Give my spot to someone who needs it more." "Soldier, your spot is guaranteed," Zara said firmly. "You're going to save the world, and you can't do that if you're dead." The horizon began to lighten, gray dawn creeping across the devastated landscape. Declan stood atop the command post, watching the sun rise on what might be his last day alive. He thought of his daughter, wondered if she'd seen this same sunrise from wherever she was. Alive, dead, or changed, he hoped she knew he'd tried. Hoped she'd understand why he'd stayed when he could have gone searching for her. The radio crackled. "Checkpoint Thorn, this is Angel Flight. We have you on visual. Preparing for combat extraction. Mark your LZ." "Roger, Angel Flight." LZ marked. Declan activated the strobes that would guide the transport helicopters in. "Be advised, you're landing in a hot zone. We'll provide suppression, but it's going to be close." "Understood, checkpoint. We're coming in hard and fast. Have your people ready to move." The sound of rotor blades cut through the morning air, beautiful and terrifying. The helicopters came in low and fast, 3 massive Chinooks flanked by Apache gunships. The Apaches immediately engaged, their chain guns tearing into the infected that the explosion of sound and movement attracted. All personnel, fall back to the LZ. Declan ordered. Wounded first, then by squad. Move, move, move. The checkpoint erupted into controlled chaos. Soldiers grabbed wounded comrades, carrying them toward the landing zone. Zara and her medical team loaded Devon and other critical patients onto stretchers. Elias rigged the final charges, ensuring the infected couldn't use the checkpoint's weapons and supplies once they were gone. Finnegan and Jamal provided covering fire, their last ammunition expended in protection of the retreat. When their rifles clicked empty, they grabbed their gear and ran for the LZ, boots pounding across ground soaked with blood and sacrifice. The first Chinook touched down, ramp dropping. Wounded flooded aboard, guided by crew chiefs who'd seen combat extractions before but never anything like this. The helicopter lifted off under fire, infected clawing at its landing gear as it rose. The second Chinook landed. Kira carried Meredith aboard, strapping her into a seat before turning back to help others. The helicopter was nearly full when she saw him. Wandering through the chaos, covered in blood and gore, wearing the tattered remains of a Denver police uniform. Thomas. Her Thomas, except it wasn't, not anymore. The infection had taken him, left only a shambling mockery of the man she'd loved. Kira, come on. Yolanda shouted from the helicopter. Kira raised her sidearm, sighting on the infected that had been her fiancé. Her hand shook for the first time in the entire battle. One shot. One mercy. One final goodbye to the life she'd planned. I'm sorry, she whispered, and pulled the trigger. Thomas fell, finally at rest. Kira lowered her weapon and walked to the helicopter, not looking back. Meredith grabbed her hand as she sat down, and Kira held on like it was a lifeline. The third Chinook landed as the sun fully cleared the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold that seemed obscene against the darkness of what had happened here. Declan was the last man standing at the checkpoint, his command staff having been forced onto earlier flights. "Sir, you need to board now," the crew chief shouted over the rotor wash. Declan took one last look at the checkpoint, at the bodies of soldiers who'd stood with him, at the position they'd held through sheer will. Hassan Mahmoud stood his ground, he said quietly, repeating Hassan's last words. So did we all. He boarded the helicopter, and it lifted off just as the infected overran the checkpoint. Elias's final charges detonated, consuming the position in fire, denying it to the horde. From the air, Declan watched the flames rise, a funeral pyre for the old world. The flight to Peterson Air Force Base took 20 minutes. The soldiers sat in silence, too exhausted for celebration, too traumatized for relief. They'd survived, but survival felt hollow when so many hadn't. Peterson was chaos. 15,000 civilians crowded every available space, with more arriving hourly from other holdouts. The military was organizing them, preparing for the long evacuation to the Midwest, where rumors said there were clean zones being established. As Declan's helicopter landed, he was met by a colonel he didn't recognize, offering a salute that Declan returned automatically. "Major Thorne, your report has been received and logged. 43 casualties, 12 hours held against a force estimated at 10,000 plus infected. You and your soldiers have our gratitude and respect, sir." "Save the speeches, Colonel," Declan said wearily. "My people need food, rest, and medical attention." "In that order." "Of course, sir. One more thing. We've been collecting refugees, matching them with military personnel who might have family. There's someone asking for you." Declan's heart stopped. "Who?" The colonel gestured to a nearby tent, and a figure emerged. Young, dark-haired, wearing civilian clothes but walking with purpose. As she got closer, Declan's world tilted. "Dad?" Rebecca Thorne said, voice breaking. Declan ran, propriety be damned, and pulled his daughter into his arms. She was alive. She was here. The world had ended, but this one piece of it was still whole. How, he managed to ask. Made it out of Boston on a military convoy. Spent 3 weeks trying to find you. I knew you'd be fighting somewhere. I knew you'd hold the line. They stood there, father and daughter, two survivors in a dying world, holding onto each other as proof that something good remained. Nearby, Kira sat with Meredith, filling out paperwork to become the girl's guardian. Finnegan and Jamal shared a meal, their friendship forged in fire now unbreakable. Yolanda and Elias planned modifications to the base's defenses, unable to stop being soldiers even in safety. Zara worked in the medical facility, analyzing Devon's blood with researchers who saw in it the hope of humanity's future. As the sun set on their first day of survival, Declan stood with his daughter, looking out at the base full of refugees and soldiers, all struggling to comprehend the new world they inhabited. What happens now? Rebecca asked. Now we rebuild, Declan said. We mourn the dead, honor their sacrifice, and we rebuild. Because that's what survivors do. That's what humanity does. But as darkness fell and the distant moaning of infected echoed across the Colorado plains, they all knew the truth. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The world had changed forever, painted in shades of death and survival. And somewhere in the darkness, the infected waited. Patient. Hungry. Endless. The checkpoint had held. The line had stood. But the real question remained, in a world of the dead, what would the living become? That answer would be written in the days ahead, in blood and courage, in sacrifice and hope. For now, they had survived. And survival, however bitter, was enough. The story of the checkpoint would be told and retold, a legend of soldiers who stood against the apocalypse and refused to break. Hassan Mahmoud, who died with a smile. The soldiers who held the line through the longest night. The little girl who reminded them why it mattered. But Declan knew the truth that would haunt him forever. They'd won the battle by losing pieces of themselves, trading innocence and humanity for survival. The real question wasn't whether they'd held the line. It was whether they'd remain human on the other side. Only time would tell. And time, in the apocalypse, was the cruelest enemy of all. END